Is it possible to remember too clearly? Now, see, our minds often forget or massage details, we emphasize others, as the events we experience are solidified into memory. And we praise people with crazy good recall skills. But like all things, there's a point where being good at something goes back full circle to being a malady, a bug instead of a feature. Now, if that's happening to you, I'd probably say it depends on the life you were exposed to, right? What are you remembering? What can't your mind escape the shackles of? Now, there are people in the world with eidetic memories, but here's kind of the fantasy curveball we get. What if the main topic of discussion around you, the issue of the day for all of your neighbors and your relatives, the leaders and subordinates, is this general lamentation over the loss of memory, and therefore the self? Well, it becomes an extraordinarily touchy subject. You're not going to be out bragging about your eidetic memory skills. In fact, it would probably become sort of an internal secret that you keep. Everyone else is petrified about losing themselves, and you can't. And I bring that up because today we're going to talk about a hero whose burden of perfect memory mixed with a strong sense of moral character is exactly what the mortal realms needed, and no one even knew it. This is the story of Iridan the Witness. Now, unlike a lot of other Stormcast heroes, we don't get a huge glimpse into the mortal life of Iridan. Like, for example, we get some snippets of Vantus Hammerhand being Vendel Blackfist, and then a few snippets here and there of Gardas as a healer in his mortal life. We get very bare bones information for Iridan. We know they were a scholar of Azerite origin, but really their story picks up with their rank of Lord-Celestant. Now that's important because, as we've already talked about in this whole Stormcast series, this means that they are a formidable hero, both personally able to lead and inspire, all the stuff like that. Now the Battle Tome states that something quite unique happened to Iridan upon their reforging. It's a little bit unclear if it's their initial forging into a Stormcast or one of the early subsequent ones as they were doing the training and that kind of stuff. But upon some of their reforging, Iridan's memory was rendered fully eidetic. As mentioned earlier in the series, there are a ton of different ways the flaw can present itself for Stormcast Eternals. Right? Some are boons, give you cool, unique powers. Others are more like curses, regardless of whether they're useful or not. They're kind of seen as this weird other by other Stormcasts. We don't like when you change. Well, in particular, Iridan got a fantastic role on the, mutation/anvil of apotheosis table. And so let's start the discussion by what does this perfect memory do to and for Iridan? Well, let's start with the upsides, right? It's easy to be positive at first. Iridan is able to devour texts on any and all subjects and retain the information with perfect accuracy and clarity. So everything from military tactics, journals, and maps of a region, how to fight specific enemies. All of those things can be recorded minutely. And this is an immediate career launcher. This is why I said I wasn't sure if they started with, the initial forging is what gave them the eidetic memory, or if it was a subsequent one. But you can't deny that is an asset. Provided that the flaw never changes that information or, faults the memory at all, this is a raw superpower and makes Iridan truly one of the most dangerous characters in Age of Sigmar from a lore standpoint. Maybe not one-to-one on the battlefield, but on a strategic level, this is massive. Because when we think about the broader context of how wars are fought when it comes to supplies and munitions and all these kinds of things, this is where you want someone with perfect recall and good organization skills. And that benefits everybody, right? Iridan being able to coordinate attacks with Fire Slayers and KO or Deepkin, whatever, understand their cultural significances, how to communicate with them, and then coordinate attacks is a superpower that benefits everybody. The sad part is, though, that the downsides only haunt Iridan, which is the worst kind of way that you are useful to your team, is when all of the downsides fall on one person. You want them diffused. Iridan remembers every scream, every village they weren't in time to save, every innocent person they had to kill because they were infected by Nurgle and they needed to be purged. They've watched friends die over and over and over again and seen the flaws erode them as people and as warriors. It's different when you and, say, another Stormcast are forged, similarly in time length, and then you work together and fight together for generations and you sort to age together. Rookies becoming veterans at the same speed. But Iridian has a very unique perspective where they're getting to watch all of their contemporaries degrade. They're not degrading with them. Iridian's perfect memory, combined with a compassionate heart for their battle brothers and sisters, just gives them this truly unmoving core, right? Where other fighters are devolving and kind of losing their sense of tactical prowess or getting swamped by emotion or visions, Iridian is just staying very even-keeled. So how do we get from a Stormcast with a good memory, the perfect memory, to what we see on the table as Iridian? Well, one night, this is all kind of couched in myth. I would love for there to be a Black Library book that extrapolates this story in particular. But one night, Iridian was offering prayers and supplications to, presumably, Sigmar, for those of her battle brothers and sisters who were being affected by the flaw. But those words were heard by another. We've discussed this a little bit in AOS lore of who you speak to in the void and say prayers to is not necessarily the same as the one who hears them. In this case, Morda answered. Now, Mor is the death god worshipped back in the old world, and in fact we have that really sick graveyard kit that they've repackaged now 1,000,000 times. That was originally called the Garden of Mor. We're given very little information about Mor, now Morda, except that a fraction of the god's power escaped being consumed by Nagash in the Age of Myth. And where Nagash is the subjugator of the dead, Morda is more representative of the warrior's peace, a solemn and respectful darkness and mourning. But it's not a craving for power and control like Nagash has. Whatever happened during this prayer session, Morda spoke through a vision to Iridian, and drew Iridian to a temple where they saw a blue flame. This flame was representing a fraction of, the death god Morda's power. The flame went into Iridian, and they were struck with visions that we know that they've only told Sigmar and Ionus Cryptborn. What the visions are, we have no idea. But these are when those visions happen, and after being struck by them, Iridian was then approached by a creature that hadn't been seen very often, and that is a Morgryph, known as Ariax. This whole event that's going on here, if we're kind of back out of it for a split second, is signifying that Morda is back, has delivered a mission in the form of that vision, and chosen Iridian as their vessel. Okay, pretty great story. We have a lot of the minor gods calling out, specific characters to act as their heralds. We have that with Balthanos and that kind of thing. And this is the part of the hero's journey where you're like, hell yeah, brother, right? We're leveling up, we're gearing up. They got a super cool flame axe. Let's go get the bad guy. And so what does Iridian do with this incredible new power and lease on life? They fly over to one of their oldest Stormcast Eternal friends who's suffering the most from the flaw, right? Going absolutely mad, being somewhat rabid, and immediately cuts his head off. Which, is a different vibe than going out with your new hero's quest weapon and fighting the bad guy. It's a bit of a bummer. So what happens next? Well, at this point, Iridian is seized by other Stormcast Eternals and brought before Sigmar. And it's important to note, it's said that, you're being charged for breaking laws that no one ever thought to codify, right? We never suspected that a Stormcast would just kill another Stormcast, so technically you didn't break the law, but, we need to have a chat. This warrants a parent-teacher conference. And it's important to note that the Stormcast who witnessed this event, right, who literally saw Iridian take out another one of their brothers, knew at that moment this was a permadeath. This was not the same thing as sending a battle brother back to Azir because their injuries are too grave or something like that. You just straight up murked a guy. When Iridian is brought before Sigmar, Ionus Cryptborn is there. And I assume at this point, it's not this explicitly said, but I assume because Ionus was thinking this might be some manifestation of the flaw. Like, what's going on? Like, are we now killing each other? Is that how far this has gone? Are we that bad off? Like, I'm sure, the chief inspector, if you will, of the moral aptitude of Stormcast would be interested to know that a Stormcast just killed another. So it makes sense to me that Ionus is part of this talk. And we get from the general context from this moment that Iridan was brought in. Like, when this happens is around the same time that Sigmar and Ionus are discussing radical next steps for what would become the Ruination Chamber. So imagine, right, these two characters, Sigmar and Ionus, already being in a super dour mood because they are having to confront the worst parts of their millennia-long grand designs. And then some newsie runs in and says that Stormcasts are now killing each other, which no one even thought to make illegal. It has to be a strange place to be in terms of headspace, when Iridan then walks in cool, calm, and collected. Clearly touched by some divine power. We don't know if Sigmar recognized it initially, but there's something different. This is not a manifestation of the wildness of the flaw. And it's here that Iridan shares the vision they were shown at the Temple of Morda. Now, this is my personal speculation, but my opinion is that Morda was listening as Sigmar talked at length with Ionus about the nature of the flaw and what to do next. Ionus is pragmatic to a level that can be seen as cruel, essentially just locking these Stormcasts up in prison or keeping them in a battery if they're in lightning form and just putting them on ice. Put them away, bury them, which is an eternity of suffering because you made them immortal. They're demigods. And in my opinion, I think Morda would not abide the end of these vaunted heroes, veterans of 1,000,000 battles. It just wasn't, this dog won't hunt. I'm not going to let you do that. So Morda assigns or anointed a messenger and sought to aid Sigmar's predicament in a way that benefits everyone. That's my personal opinion, that this conversation was already going on because of the timing of when it happened to Iridan with this vision being brought in to Sigmar and Ionus, and then immediately inducted into this new vision for the Ruination Chamber. It makes me think that Morda wanted something, or to contribute in some way. So from that moment, what's changed since then? Well, despite being the first Stormcast Eternal to truly kill another Stormcast, like permakill, Iridan, now Iridan the Witness, is the perfect hero to act as the moral anchor of the newly revamped Ruination Chamber. We talked about before, the Ruination Chamber existed for flawed individuals, but not at the quantity that Stormcast were eroding. Ionus wanted to just simply make this a retirement stop, just lock them away, and his practicality needed to be tempered by empathy and respect, like a warrior's respect. And so, Sigmar saw fit to elevate Iridan to that role. Now on the surface, that can sound very lame, right? Ionus has the plan, and Iridan is there to make everyone feel good about themselves while they do it. So everyone can say that we cared about our heroes till the very end, but it really is not like that. Because Ionus' plan was simply to isolate and quarantine, contain what's going on. Iridan's plan was to understand it. What is the nature of degradation? Right? The Sacrosanct was out looking for cures for it, but not as much understanding of how to live with it. Iridan experiments with treatments. In fact, these kind of treatment tests led to the foundation of the memorian chamber, which we talked about in another episode, but essentially mortals that travel with the Ruination Chamber that exist to keep those Stormcast grounded in reality. It reminds them of their past, shields them from vicious flashbacks that would otherwise leave them helpless on the battlefield, and it becomes a very practical application of empathy and compassion. When a warrior degrades too far so that even a memorian's presence can't soothe what's happening, Iridan's order is there to also act as executioners, so that they are not just locked in a vault for an eternity of madness. Ionus. And the benefits are massive, because the way that I see it in my head, Ionus had a plan to separate the flawed Stormcast from the healthy ones, but Iridan's contributions allowed those flawed Stormcast to remain a fighting force. Right, keeping warriors on the battlefield longer, keeping their skills sharp, keeping them following orders. Iridan is what turned this from being the retirement home for broken Stormcast into a chamber that can fight, because these are warriors that can now be called upon. And so right now, that is where Iridan the Witness stands, basically co-leading the Ruination Chamber from a high level and committing to eidetic memory the names and deeds of every single Stormcast Eternal who is reassigned to the Ruination Chamber. Because at that point, Iridan can guarantee that someone will remember them. Someone will remember their greatness, their storied heroism, and offer heroes not just, the most compassionate ending to a career that you can offer a Stormcast, but to also give them the release of a final death. Now, of course, it's not all scholarly business, right? That's a lot of bookkeeping and tracking and records keeping. Iridan, remember, started off our story here as a Lord-Celestant, okay, and now has a sweet mount. Ariax is one of the coolest models ever, and so that means that they are active on the battlefield. And one thing that's kind of hard to articulate in this specific video is that the overall vibe of this edition is that chaos is the big bad. Chaos has the initiative. We're in the hour of ruin. The existing Stormcast Eternal lines are constantly grinding against the enemies of chaos and getting whittled down. Both sides are, but of course there's billions of Skaven and only a couple Stormcasts, relatively speaking. Now, there are some who say that the art of generalship is how you handle your reserves, meaning how you cycle your troops out, you keep things fresh. The reason that the Ruination Chamber features so much in this edition is that this is the moment when those reserves are unleashed. The enemy didn't even know that these whole chambers of Stormcast from every storm host existed. Not only do they exist, but they're like super deadly fighting wars. Remember, Ruination Chamber, these are veterans of like thousands of battles. So Iridan's forces, the grander concept of Ruination Chambers across all the different storm hosts, are now mobilizing to relieve battered war fronts, exact disciplined counterattacks, go into the worst places, not because you're expendable, but because of Iridan, you're still capable. And this is an all-hands-on-deck moment. Those are some massive, changes to the lore as far as the structure of the Ruination Chamber, and it also places Iridan the Witness as a fantastic character in the ongoing events of understanding what it is for the nature of the soul, Stormcast, the degradation, the flaws, all of that. But I'd like to end this video like I end all of them by simply asking the question, why is this cool? This is going to start a little grim, but I promise we'll get positive. I used to work in hospice, which if those of you, if you don't use that word, it's just the caregiving you give to old folks before they die. And I can tell you, it is a very peculiar feeling to both want the best for someone, but also have that include them passing away. It feels incongruous. Family members of the people that I'm working for will often talk about this dissonance, right? Because you know that the only good thing left for someone who's hurting is release. It's exceptionally morbid, but it's the truth. There's a time to let go, which doesn't sound particularly revolutionary to you or me, but if you are, presumably, an immortal demigod with the power of a deity flowing through you, the thought actually might not cross your mind. Iridan does two things within the Ruination Chamber to make the chamber as a whole greater than anything else, than the sum of its parts. Right? Ionus could have segregated them and locked them away on his own. Iridan keeps them fighting, and does so well. The Ruination Chamber are active fighting forces, but at the same time as pushing them further than Ionus would have, Iridan also sets a boundary on the amount of suffering that they will allow. Essentially saying both you deserve to fight as honorably and as fiercely as you can to the bitter end, but I promise you that I will give you a, rest now moment for the prolonged horror that is a Stormcast Eternal's life. There will be a moment when you've done enough. And Ionus never offered that. It's just a spark of humanity that can't fade or erode because of the loss of the self. And it's uncomfortable, but it's what I love about fantasy and sci-fi, when we can talk about these very morbid concepts, but we're removed from enough from it to just kind of like look at it from a distance. Now, of course, I'd also be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that Iridan the Witness is a non-binary character using they-them pronouns. And I'll say up front, it does absolutely nothing to enhance or diminish the story, it just is. And I'm happy. Iridan has enough accolades and plot motivation to be interesting on their own instead of just being a character for token representation. The things that are cool here about bringing in another deity from the old world, a whole new line of basically thought patterns when it comes to how we deal with the flaw is interesting enough. Which is good, because it's never fun when it feels like characters are included just cuz. On a broader note, when the writers were developing this idea of the Ruination Chamber, I'm really glad they took a moment to add a character who was new. Like, we knew Ionus Cryptborn from when AOS first started, but the more perspectives we get about the flaw, how it affects people, and how Stormcasts perceive it, meaning, like, do we treat them like they're pariahs, or do we treat them with compassion and care? All of those things go into forming a better picture of what it means to be a Stormcast now. And I think Iridan the Witness really exemplifies this. Like I said, I would adore for there to be a Black Library novel about that initial calling of Morda, whatever that vision was like. Maybe a scene where they meet Arax would be really cool. But regardless, this is a great character. I was very excited to cover them. And I hope you'll take a second to check out the model because it is worth painting. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this video. If you would like to save some coin whenever you buy Age of Sigmar, or really any kind of wargaming products, please consider using any of the links in my link tree down below. You'll see how much money you save from them right there in the title, and every time you do, it throws a tip in my tip jar that supports me, my wife, our cats, the whole thing, and I just could not be more thankful for all of you. Let me know what else you would like to learn about when it comes to the Stormcast, and I will see you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Happy wargaming!